All right, we have Professor Tim Noakes, one of my health heroes on the Made to Thrive show. He's been a pioneer in the health field, in the science field, in the sports medicine field. Today, I'm overwhelmed with gratitude that he's accepted to take this interview and podcast on. He's been someone that's been on my bucket list to interview as well as spend the day with. And we were joking around earlier that I would pay his daily rate just to have a whole day to pick this incredible man's brain who's an international pioneer in health. I hear him being spoken about all over the world, and I hear these podcasts and read the stories, and I say, that's my Tim Noakes. And I say, that's a professor from South Africa. So welcome to the Made to Thrive show, Prof Noakes.
Thanks, Steve. Lovely to be with you. Look forward to the next hour or so.
Brilliant. Well, I do want to start and say this man is full of credentials, and he runs some really fine community groups, the Nutrition Network, Eat Better SA, and the Noakes Foundation. And I was following Dr. Mark Hyman, who you probably do know, who said community is the greatest force to bring about sustained health change. And so tell us about your foundation, about Eat Better SA and the Nutrition Network, and what you're doing with these communities.
Thanks, Steve. Well, when I started writing a lot and also being a little bit contentious, I realized that I had to have no conflicts of interest. So I always donate all the money from my writings into various foundations. And the first one was to fund research. And I funded a senior researcher for the last 10 years, my wife and I. That was from the Prophets of Law of Running and a few other books. When we wrote The Real Meal Revolution, it suddenly raised R1 million for each of the authors, which was quite a shock, because that's kind of unusual, as you can imagine, in South Africa. And so people suggested you should start the Noakes Foundation, which I did. And so I fund that in many other ways as well. We're a tiny organization, but we still try to make a difference. So when we started, we raised about R8 million from overseas to look at the biochemical changes in people eating a low carbohydrate diet, particularly athletes. Yeah. And we published a couple of papers on that. And then that money ran out. And so we then decided, well, let's see where we should be going. And immediately people said that the problem with the diet is it's too expensive and you're going to be criticized for that. So my team said, well, we can actually answer that one. Let's start a program called the Eat Better South Africa campaign, which allows people to eat for 30 Rand a day. And I appreciate for many, that's a lot of money. But for 30 Rand a day, we were able to show in communities in Cape Town, poorer communities, that those people who were eating this diet were getting healthier. They were reversing their type 2 diabetes. They were putting their blood pressure under control. They were losing weight, and they were really benefiting hugely from it. So that's the one program. And then as we went along further, we realized that we must change the doctors. We must educate the doctors. And so it was not my idea at all. It just came from Jane Bullen, who's my director of the foundation. She very cleverly said, listen, why don't we have a conference and we'll film it, and then we will use that as an educational platform. And it just went mad. We couldn't believe the interest in the programs. And so we've been doing that for about 2 years now, and we've trained probably a couple of thousand doctors globally on the Nutrition Network. Brilliant. So it's been a hugely successful program. And we think that it's one way of upskilling doctors and getting them to accept these ideas and to start changing people's lives. Because we know that each doctor will change so many people's lives, that they are the key players in what we're doing.
Well done to you. You're serving all different socioeconomic groups, and from those that are really poor and poverty-stricken to the doctors that are wealthy, that have the finance to learn, to educate themselves, and then to impart that knowledge onto their patients and their different communities. So well done to you. I'm a personal beneficiary of just your education and your pioneering heart to see people's lives just become absolutely free from enslavement to big pharma, to big food and things like junk food and these carbohydrate diets that are often filled with processed carbs. So well done to you. I must say, this book over here, Challenging Beliefs, is something that I hold dear to my heart. And when I did read it, I did cry a few tears, because I realized here's someone who has so much credibility in the scientific community. You know, over 750 peer-reviewed scientific papers, many books that you've written. It's almost was in your glory days where you could have received more accolades. And here in your glory days, you came up with this revelation because you got sick, you got type 2 diabetes, and you became insulin resistant. So tell us the story of what actually happened with your own health, and then the courage and the boldness to take on the rest of the scientific community.
Yeah, thank you. I think had I known, it would have taken more courage. But in my naivety, I thought that everyone wants to hear the truth. That's all people want. And I realized that's the last thing people want. We're not being told the truth anymore. And it's frightening as a scientist to realize that the distortion, facts no longer matter. And if you're fighting for facts, you've got a long, hard road. So my story is that my dad died of type 2 diabetes, and he didn't die of the disease. He died of the bad management, the incorrect management. He was told to eat lots of carbohydrates and to snack on chocolates and sweets all day. I mean, it was astonishing. And the tragedy was that this went for 10 years, and I watched as it happened, because I'm a medically doctor trained conventionally, and I thought, well, diabetes, once it gets you, you've had it. And so that was my attitude. And so he died a most awful death. And it definitely left big scars on me. But I never thought that I would be prone to his genetic susceptibilities, which of course was stupid. So here I was eating this high carbohydrate diet, running lots of marathons, and thinking that because I was relatively lean, I'd be fine. But yet, as I look back, I got progressively fatter. I put on about 20 kilograms from when I was a youngster, from my 20s to my 60s. And I thought that's natural. That's what happens. And I think I wasn't as alert as I might have been. My running got worse and worse. And then eventually I opened my emails one morning, and there was an article saying lose 6 pounds in 6 weeks without hunger, written by 3 of my favorite scientists. And there was Volek, Finney, and I see the book right behind you.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorites.
Westman, Volek, and Finney. And I said, they sold out to Atkins. How could they do it? So I went immediately to the local bookshop and bought the last copy of the book and brought it home. And it was a Saturday morning, it was a Monday morning. It was holidays. I had lots of time to read. And I started reading it, and 2 hours later, in the introduction, it said there are 150 studies of low-carb diets and the beneficial effects. And I said, but that's nonsense. I mean, here I'm a nutrition scientist. I know the field, and there's no such thing as studies showing that low-carbohydrate diets are beneficial. They're harmful. We know that. You've got to stop eating fats. So I looked at the articles, and then I saw that they're all referenced properly in American Journal of Clinical Nutrition and other journals. So I went online and started looking at the articles, and then I thought, oh my gosh. So 3 hours later, I told my wife, I said, that's it, the carbs, we're done with carbs. And so for lunch, I had some biltong and I think some cheese.
Okay.
And that started it, and I started cutting the carbs from that moment and haven't looked back for the next 10 years. And what I noticed was within 6 weeks, my health had dramatically improved. And my running had got improved dramatically. I got back to where I was at 20 years earlier.
Wow.
So I managed to reverse a lot of the complications of having high blood glucose, because clearly that's what I had continually, these high glucose and spiking my glucose all the time.
But Prof, was it nature or nurture that where you had this revelation? You realize, actually, I'm going the same route as my father. Now I've got to make a decision. I've read this book now. These are 3 scientists. They've got it wrong. I think they've got it wrong because I know the science. I'm a nutritional scientist. Now what do I do? So you changed your diet. You saw the revelation, but you didn't only change it personally and live with it. You now started to declare and started to preach this low carbohydrate, high fat diet.
Yeah, and it was because for me it was a miracle. It was unbelievable because I've always tried to control my weight, and we all do the same old thing: calories in, calories out. And I can remember the days that I didn't eat any fat. I used to say, "Gosh, you went the whole day without eating any fat," and you can imagine what I was eating. I mean, the terrible stuff. So I must tell you these little sidelines. So anyway, it turned out that 8 weeks after I started, I had to go to Stockholm to talk to some elite athletes. And I was very conscious that I was overweight. And I thought, if I could lose that 6 pounds in the 6 weeks, make it 7 pounds, that'd be amazing.
Yeah.
So anyway, I went to Stockholm and I'd lost 20 pounds. I'd lost 10 kilos. I lost 10 kilos in the first 8 weeks. It was miraculous. And so now, and then from being unable to run, they forced me to run. I had to run 10 kilometers one evening. And the next day we ran 20 kilometers in minus, I forget what it was. It was minus, it was freezing. And I did the 30 kilometers within 24 hours. Now, before that, I couldn't run 5 kilometers.
Wow.
And that's how, then I realized, there's something magic about this for me as a person with insulin resistance. So you can imagine how it was. And then I started thinking, well, my job now is to tell the rest of the world. And I was, because people said, gosh, you look fantastic. How did it happen? And so then I wrote an article for Discovery Health magazine because I was then a writer funded by them. And that was the end. Well, that was the finish, because then I lost all my funding and everything went out the window very quickly.
Yeah, but the legacy you're leaving is that actually here is a man who is an A1 graded scientist, one of our best, if not the best South African scientist and doctor, well known across the world, who said, I've made a mistake. Okay. I mean, I remember the stories. I came on to second year, medical campus studying anatomy and physiology. And we were told to carbo load. And I used to eat all these carbs before I was running the day before, 700 to 800 grams before a 21K. And I felt terrible. And what I noticed, my heart rate was high. I didn't perform as well. And I said, hang on, these are scientists and I'm just a second year student here, but I don't feel good. And I started realizing, hey, let me change this. Maybe I'm the enigma, maybe I'm the outlier, maybe that's for the general population, but my performance improved. And over the 95, 96, 2 years, I lost 20 kilograms. And I didn't lose it with calorie in and calorie out. I didn't lose it with a high carbohydrate diet and trying to outrun my diet. I lost it with a low carb, high fat diet. And so that was significant for me because I actually felt it in my body. I felt it in my performance. Obviously, I saw, my fat, percentage started coming down as well. And I've always been a bit of a biohacker to have a look at my data, and my heart rate just started improving. Through the night I'd wear a heart rate strap and check it and see what happens if I had a high carbohydrate meal the night before. I'd see what happened when I'm running afterwards, look at my different splits. So I felt it personally. Although the literature and the research and what everybody was saying, and this amazing professor down in Cape Town was saying carbo load. And after 11 comrades and everyone going to the pasta party on a Friday night, I just never went to one. My sister in Durban used to say to me, do you want a full bowl of pasta the night before comrades? And I said, no, I feel terrible. I feel terrible eating all these carbohydrates. So, I've got a personal story there of what actually happened. But the legacy that I have personally is a scientist, a pioneer like you, who had the courage to say, listen, carbo loading is not true, and here is the real science, and here's the real truth. Now, was that nature or nurture? Tell me your story.
Well, I've come from a very interesting family. So my father was third generation tobacco importers into Liverpool. So that kind of gets the story going on the right foot. So he was third generation tobacco importers. And of course, Liverpool is linked to New York. So the tobacco used to come from Virginia and the southern states, and it would come to Liverpool. And of course, Liverpool was the center of the Beatles because they got the music from North America. The first, it arrived at Liverpool long before it got to London. So that's why the Beatles could be ahead of the game with their music, because they stole a lot of ideas, obviously, from American music. But so my father then was a remarkable man, because when the Depression hit in the 1930s, my grandfather said to him, listen, I can't afford to keep you for the next year. He gave him £5 and he said, here's £5 and there's a ticket to Canada. And I want you to go to Canada and learn about the tobacco industry by working as a laborer on a farm, a tobacco farm in Canada. And that was his introduction. And he was such an astute man that he very soon picked up the American way of doing tobacco and running the business. And he then came back, fought the war, and after the war, he decided that he was taking his family to Southern Rhodesia, as it was then. And so in 1946, he left Britain with nothing.
Sure.
He brought my mother and my sister to Cape Town, and they literally got on the car and drove to Salisbury, as it was then, Harare, and stayed in the hotel and started his business there. So he was an amazingly brave person. And to have done that, I think that takes real courage. And I think I was always impressed by his incredible courage to have done something like that.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's the nature side of it.
Okay.
And the nurture was, you mentioned in our previous that I went to America in 1968 on an American exchange program. And that was just an amazing, amazing year for me. It was the same year that Chris Barnard did the first human heart transplant. And that influenced me because I didn't have a clue what I wanted to study when I left matric, because I was quite young. I went to do the military, then I went to overseas for a year. And if that transplant had never happened, I wouldn't have done medicine. I've absolutely no question about it. But I did medicine, and very quickly, I was so fortunate because 1968 was a pivotal year in many things. But it was a pivotal year in sport because it was the year that the East Germans first got back into international sport, and they started challenging the North Americans. And the Americans were scared, and they started saying, we've got to apply science if we're going to beat them. The other thing was that the 1968 Olympic Games were held at altitude in Mexico City. And no one knew, honestly, literally, there was not one scientist in the world who knew what the effects of competing at altitude would be. They didn't know if all the athletes were going to die or not. The only questions they had when Mexico City had been given the Olympics, they'd said, is it dangerous? So one of the Mexicans got up and said, no, it's fine. Absolutely healthy to compete at altitude. And that was it. That was sports medicine. Yeah. And so I went into medicine in 1969, and it was at a time when sports science was just taking off. And I did physiology in 1970, and I had zero interest in physiology as it relates to medicine. I just wanted to study sports medicine and sports science. And so my whole training in medicine was biased towards, I would look, what's the relationship to sport of what we're studying here? And I managed to graduate as a medical doctor without knowing anything about treatment of disease. I still haven't a clue. And because I had no interest in that. I was always interested in the human potential and exercise, the role of exercise.
Yeah, good.
So that's how it got. I would just make one last point, though. In 1970, I remember going to speak to the professor of physiology. He was a strange man at UCT. He wasn't the greatest scientist. And he showed me a paper with a muscle biopsy technique where the Scandinavians had measured muscle glycogen content in their athletes. And they'd supposedly shown, and they had not shown this, but I wasn't a scientist enough to realize it, that if you had more glycogen in your muscles, you performed better. And that was the basis of the carbo loading story.
All right.
And it was named after a guy called Saltine, and I became quite close to Saltine over the years. But we never saw eye to eye. And although he was a very well-recognized scientist, I always thought he had some limitations because he couldn't understand the role of the brain. And sometime before he died, he said he regretted that he hadn't discussed more with me the role of the brain in exercise performance, because he realized he'd ignored it because they were such peripheral fatigue people. They thought all the periphery was in the fatigue, and it was all linked to muscle glycogen.
Okay. Good. So a bit of nature, a little bit of nurture, some bravery, some circumstantial chance of, going as an exchange student, meeting a good friend there who said, start up rowing. You started rowing, you started rowing, you started running. You started running, you started looking at sports science, and so the train goes on. But you still had to make this decision to declare publicly this branch of knowledge. And, that little explanation is actually, I'm into words. The etymology of professor is to declare publicly, all right, a branch of knowledge. So the true professors declare publicly. And the word doctor is the Latin, and my Latin's lousy, but it, from my Cincinnatian's days, is the word docere. And docere means to teach. So you've been teaching and declaring publicly as a professor and doctor. So thank you so much. And I think there are many, many people out there that are truly grateful. I do want to go a little bit into the details and into the weeds of low carbohydrate, high fat, the differences between LCHF, if they are keto, this ketogenic diet, and this Banting diet. Are there differences, or are they the same?
Yeah, I don't think there's much distinction, really. It's just how much carbohydrate you eat. I mean, that fundamentally is your level of insulin resistance determines how much carbohydrate you can tolerate. Okay. And when you've got type 2 diabetes, you have to go below 25 grams. So that's going to be a ketogenic, very low carbohydrate diet. And that's the most extreme diet. But if you are not as insulin resistant and you don't have type 2 diabetes, then the key is just to make sure you don't get too much carbohydrate for too long, because then you might well become progressively more insulin resistant. So I just think it's all related to how much carbohydrates in the diet. That's, to me, is the main determinant of how the diet will affect you.
It seems like the ketogenic or the keto diet has sort of become very popular. Is that because LC, which is low carbohydrate, high fat, there's a macronutrient missing there, the protein? A lot of people do high protein, the insulin still comes down, they lose weight, but they were almost on a low carbohydrate, high fat, high protein diet. And is that the true keto diet? Will they get into nutritional ketosis? And what is nutritional ketosis?
Yeah, nutritional ketosis is when the liver starts pumping out lots of ketones because the insulin levels are very low and there's a lot of fat coming from the peripheral tissues to the liver, and so it converts it into ketones. And we're really only just beginning to understand ketones, but it's quite, just as an aside, when I was doing my PhD in medicine in 1978, I was helping Johann Kuslak, and who was a brilliant physiologist. He became professor of physiology at Stellenbosch University. And one day he came in and he said, Tim, sorry, I wasn't a prof then. He said, Tim, I'd really like to study post-exercise ketosis. Now, this is 1978. And I said, why? He said, well, the last paper on post-exercise ketosis was in 1936, and no one knows what's causing it. So I said, but I know. So he said, what? He said, it's when I go on my low-carb diet, when I'm doing this carbo depletion, carbo loading diet. So we used to do 3 days where we ate 0 carbs, and we would collapse in a heap, and we'd run. We tried to run every day. And it was too terrible. I don't know quite to what extent it was a placebo effect, but you couldn't run. And then for 3 days, as you've described, you would just load up on carbohydrates. And my wife would say, but your breath smells terrible for the 3 days I was on the low-fat diet. And so I told Johann, I said, listen, I'm sure it's a low-carb diet, and becoming liver glycogen depletion has got something to do with it. So he said, fine, well, let's experiment. So we did an experiment where I would run on the treadmill for 2 hours, either having followed the low-carb diet or a normal diet. And in those experiments, we measured insulin. And when I was on the high-carb diet, my insulin was 6 times normal, 6 times normal. My fasting insulin was 30, compared to a value we liked about 6. And it didn't normalize. The whole day, I would go and run. I'd still run my 2 hours. By the end of the day, the insulin was still elevated. So on the high-carb diet, I was profoundly insulin resistant at that point. So anyway, we then showed very quickly that as soon as you ate carbohydrates or protein, you shut off the ketosis. So within 30 minutes, the ketosis would disappear. So I've got this lovely graph of myself going from 0 to 3 millimoles in the course of the run, and then a few hours of post-exercise not eating. And then as soon as you eat carbohydrates, it just goes straight down, woof, like that. So that's the key. So I think a ketogenic diet's really difficult because it has to be quite high fat and very little carbohydrate and quite little protein. So I think that probably is really good for people who have advanced metabolic disease. Okay. But I'm not sure that it benefits everyone else to be on a lower protein diet. I'm beginning to think that protein is a pretty important constituent, particularly as one gets older.
Okay. So how would you reframe the LCHF? Would it be LCHF and medium protein? So, because we're missing a macronutrient, and I've always been concerned about that. What do people do with the protein? Because I see, a lot of these men having Biltong every day, and they're having all this meat, and because they want to put something in their mouths often, and so what happens is we start seeing high ferritin levels, high heme levels in the blood, and that's a heavy metal in itself. So, if we have to use the acronym, what do you suggest?
Yeah, I think that you make some good points. The reality is that the diet's not high in fat. It's only relatively high because you've cut the carbs so seriously that now if you eat the same amount of fat, as I did, I did an analysis of my own diet, and I reduced my carbohydrate consumption by a third. So my calories came down a third without hunger, of course. But the fat intake stayed exactly the same. And the reason was that when you're eating a rubbishy diet, you get so much fat from rubbish, from chips and all the baked foods, which are full of fat, which we don't recognize that. And once you clear all of that out and you replace it with butter, that sure, you look like you're eating a lot more fat, but in reality you aren't. Okay. So the diet is not necessarily high in fat. It's only by proportionate it suddenly shot up. You tend to eat the same amount of protein, and therefore all of a sudden the fat becomes a larger proportion of the total. Okay. So I follow Ted Naiman, and I know he thinks that we don't eat enough protein, that we should focus more on the protein and less fat, and argues that if you want to lose fat, you really have to restrict fat. My problem is that my brain likes to eat fat, and so if I'm not satiated, then I just overeat calories anyway. So I think what I normally tell people is find out what satiates you. And if protein satiates you, then load up on protein. If it's fat, then you must load up on fat. Okay. I know that a lot of women struggle because they find fat actually doesn't satiate. It makes them even more hungry, which is not what it's meant to do.
Yeah. So protein is sort of a debatable sort of subject with regards to the LCHF, although some people like to refer to keto. I've been measuring nutritional ketosis as above 0.5. Would you agree with that? Is it important for people to measure because of the benefits of ketosis on the brain, on the different organs, making sure that you're metabolically flexible? Maybe you can expand on that.
Yeah, no, I think that the more ketotic you are, the evidence seems to suggest the better. But whether that's 0.5 or 1 millimole, I don't think we know as yet. But I think if you're on 0.5 compared to everyone else's 0.01, that's the average. The average South African or person following this podcast would be at 0.01 if they're eating a high carbohydrate diet. So being 0.5 is a massive increase, and so that's going to be great. I know a lot of people can stay at 2 or 3, but I personally could only get there if I starved and then do lots of running. Okay. I can get my values up there, but it seems to me you become more and more resistant to ketosis as you do the diet for longer.
Okay. What are the challenges of just being in nutritional ketosis for too long? I mean, I've noticed my insulin levels, my last 6 numbers have been 2.8, 3, 3.2, 3.5. That's where my insulin levels are. My fasting insulin level is. Is that too low? Is that a problem? Do we then not able to process carbohydrates sufficiently?
No, I think that sounds excellent. I think in my discussions, a value of 5 or 6 is where problems start. And I mean, of course, that's way below what we as doctors say is a normal value. But a value of 5 is the upper limit of what you should be. So I would guess that your values are perfect. Mine are also pretty much there. you are going to be insulin resistant, but that's not a pathological state. That's a physiological state, and that's the distinction I make. So if I'm going to have a glucose tolerance test, even if I wasn't diabetic, it would be abnormal because we're just not used to coping with carbohydrate, and we lose the receptors or the glucose pass. The way glucose is taken into the cells, those pathways are reduced. But that's all good because that's how humans were. We were always that way. Yeah. We're designed to be slightly insulin resistant. We're brought onto the earth, insulin resistant. That's if our mothers didn't eat too much carbohydrate. So insulin resistance is the natural state of the human. And it's not something that would concern us or should concern us.
So is the keto diet, can I put you on the spot here? Is the keto diet for everybody?
That's a great question, and I'm thinking about whether I should say yes or no. And the answer is, I would say, in my experience, I've met one or two people who literally can eat all the carbohydrate they like, and they look fantastically healthy. And one of them is Brian Chamberlain, who won the Two Oceans Marathon in the 1977, and today his weight has not changed 1 inch, 1 kilogram over the next 40 years. He runs almost as fast as he did then. That's a bit of an exaggeration. But of all my friends, he's the one guy who hasn't aged. His running is still the fastest. So every so often there's a 5K race of all the people who ran in the 70s. And Brian always wins it by minutes. And he's eaten a high carbohydrate diet. And he says, you see, Tim, I completely disprove everything you stand for.
But Prof, there are those outliers and all those, but you speak into the general population and you've seen the studies. I mean, we know how studies work, the meta-analysis of RCTs. It's for the general population. You do see general, all these inflammatory markers and this insulin resistance decrease. And from your trial, I mean, your trial showed you destroyed him by science. You won that trial by science. And I mean, I want to do a dance, and I don't think it was celebrated long enough. But just give us the scientific. You beat them via science. The data shows that the low carbohydrate diet has shown that it is beneficial for insulin resistance and to help people with type 2 diabetes. Am I right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so the answer is I would say yes. I'd say that should be the default diet. And if you do well, if you're still fine eating carbs, well, that's very unusual. And you see, you've got to get to my age at 71 and then start worrying about what your brain function is, and also how your osteoporosis is and your osteopenia. What the person who ultimately betrayed me, but who was my professor for my PhD, when he died, he was demented. He had complete osteoporosis. He'd shrunk at least about a foot, and his osteoporosis eventually caused him all sorts of problems. And he asked me, so what must I do because my brain's not good? I said, eat more fat. And he literally had not eaten fat for the last 60 years of his life because he was so committed to the cardiovascular effects of a high fat diet. He thought that'd give him heart disease. And I just saw him being destroyed by this diet, and no one questioned when he died that he'd been an extremist. And no one said, well, maybe the fact that his diet was deficient in all the vitamins that you need for building bone, for all the nutrients you need to keep your brain in shape. No one asked that question. And because, but at 80, you're meant to look like that anyway. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I've seen people of 100 who look pretty good on this diet. So that's what I'm hoping for.
So in summary, the diet is for everybody, but there are those outliers that could eat carbohydrates or significant amounts of carbohydrates and still maintain a good glycemic variability. They don't get huge spikes in this glucose. They don't become insulin resistant, but they are the outliers. Although the outliers that the game changers refer to, because I got the flurry of questions. Now everybody's game changing. Now everybody's doing vegan, diets, and I've got no, judgment on people that do it for spiritual or ethical reasons. Everybody's got to decide on their own health and take own accountability for their health. But I got the flurry of questions. Should we all become vegans, and should we all become vegetarians? And 100 scientists that are supporting James Cameron's views on game changers, and meat's bad, and meat causes cancer, and meat causes heart disease. Tell us about that and the game changes and what's happened there.
Okay, well, there were 6 papers in the Annals of Internal Medicine in the middle of last year, showing that there is no evidence whatsoever that red meat is linked to any form of disease, and certainly not cancer. And they completely debunked everything that has been said. And the argument against meat comes from associational studies from Walter Willett, who is himself a vegetarian and very strongly anti-meat because he's from Harvard, and Harvard has for the last 40 years had an anti-meat stance. So he has got, in my view, he's got no credibility to tell us that we shouldn't be eating meat. So there literally is no evidence that meat is dangerous. Is there evidence that meat is good? Well, the answer is yes. If you look at if you're raising children, the clear evidence, if you raise them on carbohydrates, they will not be as healthy as if you raise them with meat-based produce. The malnutrition is caused by raising children on high carbohydrate diets, which are deficient in fats and protein. It's absolutely clear, and I think that the older people as well, if you raise older people on carbs, and that's what happens as you get older, you get put away in an old age home and you just fed carbs, and you deteriorate very, very quickly as a consequence. So my view is that then the final point is that there has never been in the natural world a vegetarian or vegan community that has survived. You simply can't survive without having supplements from animal produce. And I look at, if people want to choose to be vegan, that's fine, but go and look at the videos of recovered vegans, and you see how dreadful they look if they keep going for 4 or 5 years. And we're talking about people who really are honestly 100% vegan. Because I think a lot of vegetarians and vegans cheat, and so that they don't look too bad. Because there's no other way you can explain how dreadful some people look and how much physically they age. If you want to age quickly, become a vegan. It's frightening to see how rapidly it happens.
And those that flourish, it seems like the Rich Rolls of the world and the Scott Jureks of the world, these amazing runners, they seem to have to supplement. So they've got to check their B12 levels. They've got to just make sure that they've got the right iron levels. And protein is difficult to get from, your hemp or your pea protein. It's not as bioavailable, although they seem to, survive. So once again, is it just for the exception out there, these vegans that are just doing well? Or is it an elimination diet where people start this vegan diet and vegetarian diet and it's just far better than the standard American diet? Or they've cut out junk food and they've cut out processed oils and they've cut out processed carbohydrates. So they feel great. But 3 years later, what do the metrics say about those people?
Yeah. Well, your great question, because we have no randomized controlled trials on vegans or vegetarians. There's no, and I think it would be unethical to put a person on a vegan diet, given our knowledge that the diet's inadequate in nutrient, is nutrient poor. So you'd actually have to put them on a vegan diet, which was highly supplemented, and would be the type of diet that those people who are surviving on a vegan diet are following. But they're the outliers as well. They're not the average vegan.
Yeah.
The average vegan is not following that diet. They're eating a rubbishy diet because they think that sugar's great and smoothies are fantastic, and then they can have their Coca-Colas and their chips and their sweets because that gives them a high and so on. So it's not what the guys like Scott Jurek who are surviving are eating healthy foods. I would argue that they're not getting the best of those foods, but they've cut out all the rubbish. And of course, if you cut rubbish out of your diet, you're going to feel better within a few weeks. But once you start becoming protein deficient and B12 deficient, then things are going to start changing.
So your summary on the game changers, Prof, fact or fiction?
It's complete fiction. I mean, it's frightening. We are just overloaded with fake news, and it's frightening now. And the scientists have no hope. If you're an honest scientist and you're trying to stand up against the industry, you have zero hope. You will be labeled, as I was, and they'll try to get rid of you in any way they possibly can. And that's the reality. The forces on the side of bad eating are so powerful. They're so entrenched. It's frightening. So, I'll give you an example. Recently, I did an interview with a journalist who I trust, And he honestly asked me, tell me about diets for COVID-19 prevention. And we had a fantastic interview, just like this. I was absolutely open. And he said, well, I'm going to go and edit it now, and it'll be up on the website within 2 hours. That's a week ago. He got shut down. I can guarantee you, because I know which website he was going to. They shut him down. They said, no, you can't say these things. You can't have a nutritional cure or preventative for COVID-19 because we have to have a vaccine. We have to, anything that's going to work that isn't a vaccine has got to be labeled as fake. And we will go that route. And that's what's happened. So South Africans are not getting the truth about the best way to protect themselves from this virus because no one's talking about nutrition.
I think that's why, Dr. Hyman's words, community is the greatest force to bring about sustained health changes. And if people like yourself, the Chris Cressers, the people that can come together and say, here's the data, here's the research, this is a community that's been absolutely transformed by these healthy guidelines. Then I think people, and technology and social media might just look up and say, hang on, there's different opinions, there's different views. Yeah, I've got to find out what works for me. I've got to take personal accountability for my own health and work in a community that is safe and celebrating of the choices that I make.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you. It's, when we wrote the book, Real Meal Revolution, we said changing one person, one meal at a time. And that's essentially what it comes down to.
Yeah.
And we have to just get the message out to as many people as possible. And I'm so proud because it looks like, there are 2 million South Africans who follow the Banting diet. Yeah. So that shows the extent to which it has percolated like a virus throughout the communities.
Brilliant. I do want to pivot here and I want to talk about CGM, continuing glucose monitoring. It's changed my life because I've realized what are the foods that I thought that were healthy that spiked my glucose, and so my HbA1c, my 3-month glucose level was 5.2, over the last few years. But I put the CGM and I used the Dexcom, and I found it being very beneficial. There are different ones out there. There's the Freestyle Libre as well that you can use, and basically, it plots your glucose every 5 minutes. And I was having this green smoothie often in the morning filled with kale, spinach, celery, all the detox benefits, all the antioxidants in there that are supposed to help with inflammation. But my glucose would spike to 8, sometimes 9. And I said, no, hang on. And that it would stay high for a long period. It wouldn't come down. And that was the only thing I was eating. I added 2 eggs to the smoothie, and all of a sudden it only went to about 6 or 6.5. And I thought, hang on, now how's that impacting these carbohydrates? So tell us about CGM. I think it's the way of the future for those people that can afford it because it's going to give us some real live data of what's going on and your view on it.
Oh, I quite agree with you. I think it's a game changer completely. It's what will validate this diet more than anything. Because people will see that they take a Coca-Cola or another type of a drink and the glucose goes to 10 or 11 or 12, and then they'll start thinking, maybe that's not such a good idea. And those lovely breakfasts with the cornflakes and the sugar and the orange juice and the banana, and then you suddenly see that that's actually a glucose tolerance test. That's all people are doing when they eat all these carbohydrates, is they're doing a glucose tolerance test 3 times a day. Well, we actually use a glucose tolerance test to detect abnormalities, not to detect health, to see who's sick. And you do it to yourself 3 times a day. And then when you watch what you see on the CGM, and then you see that it just doesn't work. You can't eat carbohydrates. And this reason is simple, because then people start to ask, so how much glucose is in my bloodstream? Well, actually 4 grams, 1 teaspoon. That's all the glucose that you have in your bloodstream.
Yeah.
And now you're going to add 10 teaspoons with the sports drink or the Coca-Cola, and 10 more with the cornflakes, and 10 more with the banana, and you wonder why the body can't cope.
Yeah.
No, it makes a little bit of logic when you see it that way.
But tell me about glycemic variability, what it does, these glucose spikes, how it damages your endothelial tissue, how it causes heart disease, having these high glucose levels. I mean, some people are sitting with high glucose levels at night. They're not realizing it at all. I mean, I noticed that if I eat within a 2-hour period of sleeping, my glucose levels are high. If I eat a carbohydrate-rich diet at night, my glucose levels are higher. These higher glucose levels, what are they doing to the body?
Okay, so my view is that the way you damage your arteries is by having oxidized cholesterol and carbohydrate glucose at the same time, and that those drive the LDL cholesterol, oxidized cholesterol, into the arterial plaque, and that then causes other things. It causes blood clotting and failure of the blood not clotting, and so those are the factors that probably make sudden death and heart attacks more probable.
Okay.
So it's the high glucose variation, the high insulin, and then these polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are making up the cell linings, and they're not what we designed for. We designed to have saturated fat and cholesterol in the membranes. So you add all those things together, and then you add smoking in as pollution and chemicals, and it all works badly. But again, I think the point we've made, very few people are going to have a heart attack, actually. It's not a common disease. When you take 100 people, it's not a common disease. What is much more common is dementia, and I think that's the one that you really don't want to have. And all these changes that are damaging your coronary arteries are just as well damaging your brain cells and making them insulin resistant. And the way to get around that is to keep your insulin glucose low and to use ketones. Okay. And there may be many other effects of ketones in suppressing inflammation as well.
Brilliant. And they're talking about Alzheimer's being type 3 diabetes, these amyloid plaques in the brain. Dr. David Perlmutter calling the brain wash, what happens at night, your lymphatic system, cleaning out all these toxins. If your glucose is high, you're not getting the repair mechanisms. You're not getting, your deep sleep and your REM sleep and this, regenerative sleep that we need to deal with all these, toxins that we're absorbing through the day. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got great respect for David. It was so funny because you mentioned in my trial and how we used evidence. And the prosecution brought one scientific paper to the party. We had 6,000 pages of scientific information. Sure. And at one point, David Perlmutter's name was raised. And there was a complete cacophony of complaints from the prosecution that you can't listen to that man, blah, blah. He writes books just to make money, and he's a fraud, and they have no clue. They had no clue how to assess information. And just, again, it's a typical, you attack the individual, but you don't look at the facts.
Yeah. So I do want to get to our questions. We've got some Facebook Live questions, Prof, and once again, so grateful for your time. So one of the questions is, what's the best way to take fat intake as a percentage of food intake? So I think what the question is here, what percentage of your food intake should be good fats? And I think you can also just expound on what is a good fat and what is a bad fat, because the LCHF is not taking in, all these the trans fats and hydrogenated oils and sunflower oils and corn oils and soybean oils and all these processed oils. So what is the best way to take fat intake as a percentage of food intake?
I think most people on the so-called high-fat diet are probably eating 50 to 70% fat. But again, that sounds a huge amount, but it's because the fat is so energy dense.
Okay.
And that's what satiates you. If you get above 50%, you'll find that you're satiated. And anyway, you can't eat more. So if you're eating fat and protein, you can really only eat up to 40 or 50% protein before it becomes toxic. So you have to provide the other 50%. It's going to have to come from fat and carbohydrates. So if you cut the carbs, it's never going to be. You're always going to have about 50% fat at the maximum. Sorry, at the lowest, because then you're eating 50% protein, and above that, it becomes very difficult to eat more protein than that. So the fats you eat are the ones the Heart Foundation tells you not to eat. So you got it. If the Heart Foundation says you must eat this fat, you say, no, thank you. We don't want to eat those fats. And those are the polyunsaturated fats, as you raise, the margarines, and particularly the shortening. And people don't know that we don't even know the chemical composition of shortening now, which is the main fat that's used for baking foods. If you're not using lard or butter as the shortening, and you're using these other things, they've gone through a new process and called interesterification, which is a new way of producing polyunsaturated fats. No one knows what those effects are. All we know is that when they started hydrogenating fats in the 1912, you heard that. That's how long we've been exposed to polyunsaturated fats. Procter & Gamble in Ohio were the first to do it. And so no one worried about the content, but it turns out at least 60% of these margarines and shortening were trans fats. And although the trans fats were considered harmful already in the 70s, they were only declared harmful in about 2015, like about 5 years ago. And restrictions were put on how much trans fats could be put in these margarines and polyunsaturated fats and vegetable oils. The problem is they came up with a new technique for hydrogenating these oils, and no one knows what the effects are. Absolutely no one knows. So if you're eating polyunsaturated fats, we have no clue as to what they're doing. Okay. But the argument is that they have to be damaging because they're not designed for our body. They're not built the way saturated fats are, or the polyunsaturated fats that you get from vegetables and animals, which are not industrially produced. Okay. So stay with animal produce fats. That's really the key, and or avocados and those sorts of things. Yeah.
Great. There does seem to be a lot of literature and sort of anecdotal evidence about thyroid issues for women having a very low carbohydrate diet. They say that their insulin levels, fasting insulin is good. You know, they've lost some weight, but they are suffering with maybe, say, a thyroiditis. You know, what can they do? Do they need more carbohydrates if they're suffering with an autoimmune thyroiditis or so forth?
Yeah, I've not really got involved there, but what I do think is if you've got an autoimmune disease, you have to look at your diet, and you need to look at the plants in the diet. Because I have a feeling that plants are, in some people, toxic and can produce autoimmune diseases. But there are other things. There are many other things. There are viruses also which can influence autoimmune diseases. So, but I would do an elimination diet if I had a patient with an autoimmune disease, and I'd get them onto a carnivore diet and see if that made any difference. If it doesn't, then it's not that, and it's something else that we don't yet understand.
Great. On a carnivore, just to wrap up, I know we're coming to the end, and so grateful once again for your time and your knowledge, but the carnivore diet, and that's not a meat diet, it's eating nose to tail, that's eating kidney fat or suet, it's eating liver, it's eating thyroid. You know, Dr. Paul Saladino, that I'm hopefully going to get on the podcast, is a big proponent of this carnivore diet and what it does to insulin, you know, how bioavailable all these vitamins and nutrients are from the carnivore diet. What are your thoughts? Is it a long-term diet that people can maintain, and is it going to help them or hurt them?
I think it's going to help, because I think the people who go on the carnivore diet have got really serious issues with their nutrition. In other words, they're eating foods that are causing them harm. And as they remove particularly vegetables, they find that they get better and better and better. And that's the case I've had. I mean, one of the very first people that I put on the low carb diet, she eventually went carnivore, and her health went up another tick. So she improved dramatically on the low carb diet, but she wasn't quite right. And when she went carnivore, she got even better. So I've seen too many good results on a carnivore diet too. I would definitely support it. But again, I don't think everyone needs it. It's like there are some people who can eat carbs. There are some people who can eat vegetables, and they don't have to restrict. And it's just a matter of finding out what works best for you, because none of us doctors can tell you what's best for you. You have to go and find it out.
But isn't that true, taking personal accountability, Prof? I mean, you look at Stephen Gundry's work, the plant paradox, all these lectins, you know, all the inflammation that they can cause. And he's got an over 90% success rate treating autoimmune, you know, by limiting lectins in the body. It seems like there's just so many, you know, theories and factors out there. I think it's just to really sort of do a self-audit. How do you feel? What do the numbers say about how you are? And I think that's where CGM comes in. Quickly, just your top 5 blood tests that people should know about. What should they check? Should they be checking HSCRP? We want to teach and empower people to take accountability. CGM and knowing your glucose levels over a 24-hour period or 3-month period, I think, is crucial. What other significant blood tests do people know about and you really speak to their doctor about?
Yeah, fasting insulin, I think, is the one I'd like to look at because you can have a normal fasting glucose but a high insulin. So you need to have the insulin. You didn't mention HbA1c, but there's some doubt about that because some people, the HbA1c is a bit more elevated than it should be. So it can give you the wrong reasons. I think you need something to tell you what the function of your liver is as well, to see if you've got fatty liver. And that would also be helpful. And no one measures LDL cholesterol, but you could measure triglycerides and HDL.
Okay.
And if you really got fancy, you might look at oxidized LDL cholesterol if you could measure that. And the small dense particles, which are not the right ones to have the LDL cholesterol. What I've learned in reading all the historical literature and the more modern literature is that once you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, you get this morass of abnormalities. They all sit there. You may be worse on one than the other, but they're all elevated. And once you go on this diet, they all come down. And there may be outliers that 1 or 2 are not perfect. But as long as you got the majority, they will tell you that you're doing well. And so I think it's the fasting insulin is one, and the triglycerides and HDL cholesterol. If those 3 are looking good, then that's excellent. If you've got a liver marker as well that's looking good, then those would be the factors. You mentioned inflammatory markers, and I'm not sure that I know which is the best inflammatory marker yet, but I would agree. If you could also show that your body was not inflamed, that would also be helpful.
Great.
And again, there's one thing we haven't forgotten: the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. Now, I don't know if you can get that measured, but I think that's underestimated because if you find that you've got too many omega-6s, then you need to increase your fish intake and do a few other things as well.
Yeah, from what I know, that can be measured. There's a lab in Cape Town that can measure that ratio. I think it's really important just because of the diet and all these processed oils that are just so hidden. I mean, looking at the CGM, I've got this amazing nut bar from one of the top retail stores that I love to bits. But when I look at the back of it and I see a sunflower oil or something like that, I'm just thinking, what is that doing to my ratio, And I don't even want
you know what? When it says sunflower oil, that is interesterified fat. It's not sunflower oil anymore.
Okay. Sure.
It's one of these made-up fats, which they just call sunflower oil because that's what it came from. But it's not. It's these other toxic chemicals that have been produced industrially now.
Okay. 2 last questions, Prof. One is Chris Kress's work on health coaches. He says the health coach is going to be the way forward to help people navigate the tricky waters of nutrition and exercise and movement and sleep and, your biohacking, your modern science, all your blood tests. What is your view on health coaching in the future within South Africa, Africa, and the world?
Absolutely critical. I mean, I have my health coach, but he does my fitness training. I cope with the health side. He just chases me with a big stick and makes sure I work really hard. So I couldn't do it without it. So yes, absolutely. I think that, I'm fortunate to be able to afford a fitness coach, but that without it, I would not be as healthy as I am. So yes, I think that they have a crucial role. And I do make the point that nutrition is number one. Your body at nutrition right. But once you got nutrition right, exercise is absolutely crucial. The two are equally critically important.
But I'm going to actually just challenge you here, and maybe because I know that I'm a challenging person myself. I don't just accept things for what they are. And Dr. Jack Cruz has mentioned you before. He says you're a smart, Prof. Tim is a really smart man. He's this neurosurgeon in America. He's written the Epi-Paleo book. And he says the right light diet, is far more important than the right food diet. And so I'm starting to look at the literature in terms of living outdoors and getting sunlight and what it does to all these receptors in our eyes, like melanopsin, that's in our subcutaneous fat, how it determines the hormonal releases from melatonin to cortisol, and making sure that we've got the right light diet as well as the right food diet, and which is more important. So I don't know what your views on light are, and I'm just throwing in that question there because I think food is important, but possibly we can get away with less nutritious food if our light is correct.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree there. I mean, I'm not feeling so great at the moment because we've been inside for so long. And I just noticed that there's something else going on. So I quite agree. And this COVID story has shown vitamin D deficiency is one of the big risk factors for a fatal outcome. Yeah. So there's things about vitamin D and sunlight that I think will become more and more prevalent, more obvious as we move on.
Okay. Last question that I ask all my guests, Prof, and it's something that's very close to my heart, is that most people, the research shows 80 to 95% of people that lose weight within 5 years will gain that weight back, plus even more. Now, what are your key tips or advice that you can give people to maintain sustained transformation in their health? What 3 things would you actually give to people?
I'll tell you one: sugar. Avoid sugar.
Okay. Avoid sugar.
Yeah, there's no question. And sugar and the sweet taste, because that's what causes the weight gain. It's the people who don't control their sugar addiction, and they try to replace it with these other stevias and those sorts of things, and that doesn't work because eventually you go straight back to the sugar. So what I've learned is that the reason the way to lose weight is you have to find the foods that completely satiate you at a much lower calorie in consumption. And you must just stick with those foods. And you can't change, because as soon as you go back and start moderating your sugar intake, the weight goes up again. And we've shown that in our studies of people who effectively reverse their type 2 diabetes. The key, they tell us, is not taking the glucose and taking the glucose drugs and getting their glucose under control. No. It's getting what they're eating under control. And as soon as they take away the cravings, they're fine. It's the cravings that kill you and make you overeat and make you fat. You have to get rid of the cravings. You've got to be able to go 24, 48 hours without even thinking about food. Then you're safe. You're not going to put on weight thereafter.
But why and how do people sustain that? Why? What's the root of it? Because I look at it and say, if you don't value your purpose and what you bring to this world, if you don't value who you are, how you can serve yourself and serve others, then you're going to just eat whatever you want. You're not going to care about your health and your performance and how you wake up and your brain function. What is there? You obviously value, who you are and your purpose and your calling and your legacy. Is that not more important than actually that decision?
Yeah, you're quite right, because we're just telling you an outcome.
Yeah.
The outcome is that you don't eat sugar. But who makes that choice? That's correct.
Yeah.
And so many people can't make that choice. And you're quite right. It's very easy for me to say that that's the solution, which is the solution. But how you get there, I don't know.
Well, I've got a beautiful 4-year-old little daughter, and I'm just saying, you've got value, you've got a purpose, you've got a calling, you've got, something to add to this world that no one else can. And if you believe that, then it makes it much easier to get up in the morning when it's cold and wet and exercise. It's much easier to change your diet and say no to the carbohydrates and the sugar, and say no to the Coca-Cola and the chips and that, So I think purpose, instilling that in the next generation, that's what I've got from you, Prof. I've got someone who's willing to stand up for, they're calling a purpose to be a teacher, to be a professor, to declare publicly. And I think your calling, if I look at your life, and it's my simple summary, your calling outweighed all the other monetary, materialistic, ego, whatever you want to call it, that was due to you because you were a great scientist. But you said, no, my calling of truth, my calling to declare what I believe, and my conscience is more important than anything else.
That's very kind of you to make that assessment. I think it's correct, although, I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but you're quite right. The truth has to be the most important. And once we release the truth, we're in real trouble. And that's what we've done. And I'm glad that I started in my scientific career when science was still honorable, but it's lost it terribly. And I'm not a pessimist, but it's very difficult to see a future for science, particularly in the fields that we talked about, because they're so dominated. And people have to take back control, and they say, no, we're not prepared to listen to industry telling us what we have to do.
Yeah.
We have to find out what is the truth and follow the truth.
Well, we're going to blow your trumpet as loud as we can, Prof. And you know what Hippocrates said? I want to end this. I could carry on talking to you like the whole day, but Hippocrates said this: let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. Isn't that good? But he said something even more important. And do you know what he said the greatest medicine of all is? The greatest medicine of all is to teach people how not to need it.
Yeah.
And that is your epitome, to teach people and educate people and inspire people not to need the medicine. And so we salute you. How can we help the Noakes Foundation? How can we help the Nutritional Network? How can we help Eat Better SA?
Well, thank you very much. I think helping to publicize it, and anyone who's got lots of money might want to drop us a few dollars or rands. That would certainly be helpful. But we're not here to do that. We're here to make it work. But I think it's in our own, what we do each day. We've got to influence more and more people, just spread this virus. And through your enthusiasm, you're changing lives just as much as I do. So that's what it is. It's a person-to-person phenomenon. We just have to keep pushing forward and showing people that this is the way to a much healthier, happier life.
And I want to try and instill hope in you, Prof, to carry on going. I want you to, I know it's been a tough season for you. You've mentioned times that emotionally has been very difficult. I've heard you speak about them on air. Be filled with hope. Prosperous is, and once again, the etymology of prosperous is to go forward with hope. And spirits, to go forward with hope. And so be filled with hope, because I think the communities that you have created are far and wide. You are highly spoken of, and I think you're a world changer. And so I want to see you in your 80s running. I want to see you, writing papers in your 80s and 90s. I've run 11 comrades, and I'm hoping and trusting to run the comrades when I'm 100. And, I would like to do another 58 comrades. If I can do them in a row, I'd love to do them. But thank you so much. I'm going to say end our Facebook Live and then just end the podcast. So thank you so much to the Facebook communities. We're going to be supporting the Noakes Foundation, Eat Better SA, and the Nutritional Network. And here is someone in South Africa that we need to be proud of. Get behind, support, blow wind in his sails. He's changing all levels of socioeconomic classes in South Africa and beyond. So thank you so much. And till the next Facebook Live. Cheers.